Christmas is often remembered as a night of peace, soft light, gentle angels, a quiet stable, a story wrapped in warmth, hope, and comforting silence. But what if that picture is incomplete? What if the night we celebrate as holy and calm was also one of the darkest nights recorded in Scripture? What if, while angels were said to sing in the heavens, orders were being signed on earth, orders that would lead to the deaths of innocent children? This part of the Christmas story is rarely told, not because it isn't there, but because it is deeply unsettling. Hidden behind the glow of the manger is a command of violence, a paranoid king, and a fear so profound that it turned a ruler against newborn life itself. This is not a retelling of a familiar holiday tale. This is an examination of something far more disturbing. Because to understand why blood was shed on the night Christ was born, we must confront uncomfortable questions about power, about prophecy, and about what happens when human authority feels threatened by God. So before we speak of peace on earth, we must first ask, why did a king feel the need to kill? And that question leads us directly to the man at the center of this forgotten tragedy, King Herod. It is tempting to simplify King Herod as a monster, cruel, irrational, perhaps even insane. But that interpretation is not only shallow, it is dangerously comforting. Because madmen are rare, rational tyrants are not. The historical record paints Herod the Great not as a deranged ruler, but as a calculating, politically gifted leader, skilled in diplomacy, construction, and survival under Roman oversight. His brutality was not the product of chaos, but of clarity. Herod ruled under a fragile legitimacy. He was not a Davidic king by blood, but a Roman-backed monarch, constantly aware that his throne rested on borrowed authority. In such a system, fear is not a weakness, it is a strategy. And the greatest threat to a fragile throne is not an army, but an alternative claim to legitimacy. This is why the question posed by the Magi, "Where is the one born King of the Jews?" lands like an earthquake. Not because a child has been born, but because a king has been named. History outside the gospel confirms Herod's pattern. He executed members of his own household, including his wife and sons, when he suspected disloyalty. The massacre in Bethlehem, then, is not an emotional outburst. It is policy. It follows precedent. It is consistent. And this is the unsettling conclusion. Herod did not kill because he was mad. He killed because he understood exactly what prophecy could do. Question for reflection. What is more frightening, a ruler who loses control, or one who knows precisely what he is doing and proceeds anyway? And perhaps a deeper question, when we feel threatened by change, by truth, by something new, how often do we too reach for control, rather than understanding? This brings us to the real catalyst of Herod's fear, not a child, but a prophecy. Modern readers often treat prophecy as symbolic language, spiritual, poetic, detached from real power. But in the ancient world, prophecy functioned very differently. It was not abstract theology. It was a public claim about how history would unfold and who would rule it. A prophecy of a Messiah was not merely a promise of comfort. It was a declaration that God himself was intervening in the order of kingship. And for rulers like Herod, this was intolerable. The gospel narrative is careful here. The Magi arrive not with weapons, not with followers, but with signs, a star, text, questions. Yet these signs are enough to destabilize an entire court. Why? Because political power depends on controlling meaning. Who is called king? Who is celebrated? Whose story defines the future? Herod does not dismiss the prophecy. He consults scholars. He investigates. This detail matters. It shows that he takes the threat seriously. A ruler who ignores prophecy is careless. A ruler who studies it is afraid. From Herod's perspective, the Messiah represents a rival king, who does not need an army, does not seek Roman approval, and does not operate within the existing system. This kind of authority cannot be negotiated with, only eliminated. Question for the audience. If truth does not need force to spread, why do systems of power fear it so deeply? And consider this reversal. The religious experts know the texts, but do not move. The outsiders read the signs and travel. What does that say about belief that stays theoretical versus belief that acts? Once prophecy is perceived as a real threat, the logic of tyranny takes over. The horror of the massacre in Bethlehem is often approached emotionally, and rightly so. But the gospel presents it with chilling restraint. There is no indulgence in gore. Instead, there is calculation. Herod does not know the child's identity, so he targets the category. He does not know the location precisely, so he targets the region. He does not know the exact age, so he expands the range. This is not rage. It is risk management. In the logic of authoritarian power, uncertainty is intolerable. When the threat cannot be isolated, the future itself becomes the enemy. And the solution is to erase possibility. This pattern repeats throughout history. When regimes fear ideas, they silence generations. When they fear change, they attack the young. The massacre is not about infants, it is about preventing tomorrow. The gospel then echoes an ancient prophetic lamenta voice of mourning that had been heard before in times of exile. This connection reframes the event. The birth of salvation unfolds within the same broken history humanity already knows. God does not wait for a clean world to enter it, which leads to one of the hardest questions in theology. Why does God not intervene immediately? Why does light appear at the very moment darkness intensifies? There are no easy answers, but the narrative refuses a simplistic faith that equates God's presence with the absence of suffering. Instead, it suggests something more demanding, that redemption does not bypass human freedom, even when that freedom is abused. Question for reflection. If God only acted where there was no darkness, where would he be allowed to enter, and perhaps more uncomfortably? What do we sacrifice when we believe security matters more than truth? Yet the deepest irony is still ahead. Herod's goal was simple: prevent the rise of a rival king, but his actions achieved the opposite. If the child were insignificant, the throne would not tremble. If the prophecy were harmless, blood would not be spilled. The very violence meant to erase the Messiah becomes evidence of his significance. Power does not react this way to irrelevance. Fear is a confession. Here the theology turns paradoxical. God does not confront power with greater power. He introduces vulnerability. A child without weapons, without status, without protection, yet powerful enough to expose the insecurity of an empire. This is the logic of the gospel. Truth does not conquer by force. It destabilizes by simply existing. Like light in darkness, it does not argue, it reveals. And this is why the manger matters. It is not accidental poverty. It is a theological choice. By entering history at its lowest point, divine authority places itself beyond manipulation, purchase, or suppression. Final questions to carry forward. What kind of power feels threatened by innocence? What kind of truth requires no defense, yet shakes thrones, and perhaps the most unsettling one? If such a powerless beginning terrified a king, what might it demand of us today? Perhaps Christmas was never meant to be comfortable, not just a celebration of light, but the moment when light exposed the darkness already there. Because if a nameless child lying in a manger could unsettle a king so deeply that he resorted to violence, then this story is not only about what happened long ago. It is about fear, about power, about what human beings do when truth threatens the stories we rely on to feel secure. History records what Herod did. That part is written. But what it means, that question is still open. So let me ask you not as a listener, but as a participant. If truth appears quietly without force, what part of us feels threatened? When light enters our lives, what darkness do we rush to defend? This is history, but what do you think this story reveals about faith, about authority, or about ourselves? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them, we reflect on them, and we learn from them. And if you value conversations that don't simplify scripture, that aren't afraid of difficult questions, you're welcome to walk this journey with us. Consider subscribing, not for answers, but for deeper understanding. Because some stories in the Bible were never meant to soothe us. They were meant to wake us up.